Going to admit all.
Later last night, and I keep on.
Here we go. Put this up bigger.
Okay.
Oh, look at all the people.
Can they see us?
I know we've got a good group joining us today. We have about 60 registered. Doesn't mean everybody will be on the call, but it's a really great turnout. So here, I'm just letting some
I guess
people into the room and we'll get started.
no, sorry, they can't see us.
I will ask you all, your cameras will automatically turn off when you log in, but to mute yourselves until you either raise your hand or have a question that you need to ask.
Mooted. Mooted? Mooted. Gordon may be on this from his office, but Lori's not. So see if I can see anybody. It comes out all right. All right.
So it is 1:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. I am Jenna Lopchinsky. I'm a field service rep for the Preservation Trust of Vermont. And Denise, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure, I'm Denise D. Bramo, also with the Preservation Trust of Vermont.
And Denise and I will be kind of your contacts for all things Bruhn, both for today and moving forward through the application process, and if you are selected for funding. So we're going to spend about 45 to 50 minutes today working through some slides, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, both big program questions, but also hopefully some time for project-specific questions. We're going to do an overview of the program, eligibility. We'll work our way through the application. We will have some breaks as we go with kind of question slides. And if you find that you're looking at a slide and you really feel like we need to stop and talk about exactly what we're looking at in that moment, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand or put something in the chat box. Denise will be keeping an eye on that, keeping in mind that there will be opportunities to kind of stop and ask questions, and then, hopefully plenty of time at the end of the presentation for Q&As. We are recording this session and it will be available on the Preservation Trust of Vermont YouTube. Pardon me while I continue to kind of let folks into the room as we get started. We will share PDF of the slides with everyone who's registered, and there will be some other resource documents that we mentioned throughout the presentation that we'll share as well. So just know that that information is coming, and hopefully you all can just kind of sit back, relax, and ask questions as we go. So thanks so much. And bear with me, I always have trouble navigating the slideshow Zoom combo. So just a basic overview of the Bruhn Grant Program so you all kind of understand how Preservation of Vermont receives this money and how we administer it. The Paul Bruhn Historic Revitalization Grant Program was created in 2018, is renamed in 2019 in honor of PTV's first executive director, the late great Paul Bruhn. These grants come from the Historic Preservation Fund, which is administered by the National Park Service. So this is federal funding that is awarded to the Preservation Trust of Vermont, and then we award out to subgrantees. And the goal of the Bruhn Grant Program, the Park Services Bruhn Grant Program, is to support historic preservation projects that provide community and economic development opportunities in rural towns and villages. And that is really the driver of Preservation Trust of Vermont's subgrant program, and also a big driver of how we're selecting our projects, which we'll talk some more about as we go. So PTV, we've been lucky enough to apply to the Park Service for 6 different rounds of funding. If we're selected for funding, we then launch a grant program based on our application, and we select subgrants through a competitive application cycle. What you see on the screen is projects from our first 5 rounds. What we're talking about today is round 6. So we've closed 2 rounds of projects. We're aiming to close a third later this year. And we have rounds 4 and 5 that are currently open, and round 6 that we're, just in the process of launching right now. And for our timeline, we are on wonderful April 11th for our webinar. The big deadline that we're looking at right now is the April 30th deadline. So if your building has not been listed on the National Register or it has not been determined eligible for listing, you need to get materials into Elizabeth Peoples, who's the state architectural historian, by the end of the month. Her email is on our website. And if you're not sure if your building has been listed or determined eligible, feel free to reach out to Denise and I to check on that, or you can take a look at the online resource center yourself and see if you can find information. If not, we'll have you, submit the DOE info to Elizabeth, and we'll spend just a couple minutes looking at that survey form so you all kind of have a sense of what information they'll be looking for. So after the DOE deadline, applications will be due by the end of the day on June 2nd. Our review panel will meet in the month of June. We'll select a slate of projects. PTV will do a risk assessment, which is a requirement of the Park Service and this federal funding. Once we go through that assessment and feel confident the projects we selected are going to be approved for funding, we will send that project slate to the Park Service. They will sign off on it, and then we'll move through notifying funded projects and then notifying unfunded projects, which should be happening kind of in mid to late July. We're expecting projects to enter the review queue. So this is federal funding, so there's a regulatory process associated with that. Enter that queue in July and August. There's a pretty long timeline that goes along with it. We expect projects to exit the review queue in December, January, if you're going in sometime over the summer, construction starting in 2026, and then hopefully wrapping up construction in 2027. And so basic eligibility criteria for the Preservation Trust of Vermont's program. All projects, all organizations need to meet this criteria in order to be eligible to apply for funding. And we really want people who are going through the process of applying and putting together those application materials to know that they're eligible to do that and that they're not putting time into something that isn't going to hopefully result in some funding. So projects must be located in a town of 7,500 or less, and we use the Vermont 2020 census data to determine which of those communities are larger and which communities are smaller. Buildings must be determined eligible for listing or already listed on the National Register, which is why that DOE timeline is so important. If you are a private property owner, if the building is, privately owned, commercial or mixed use, those buildings must be located in designated downtowns or village centers, in addition to being eligible for the National Register and being located in a community of 7,500 or less. If you're not sure if you're located in one of those designated areas, the Vermont Planning Atlas is a great resource. You can just pop in your address and it'll give you kind of a map like to what you see on the screen. And as long as your building is in one of those wonderfully colored in yellow or red areas, you should be all set. And all work that is funded by Bruhn and happens while the Bruhn grant is active must meet the Secretary's standards. And so one of those screener questions is that we'll ask, if the work will do that and if it will be completed kind of on an appropriate timeline. All owners must be willing to accept a term easement, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about those term easements later on. That's always a question that we get a lot. A lot of people have questions about those easements. Projects have to be completed by June of 2027. The National Park Service has been a wonderful partner in this grant program and has really provided a lot of flexibility with timelines in the past. However, given the uncertainty at the federal level right now, we are less confident in that ability to extend our period of performance for this grant round. And so we are really looking to fund projects that are able to meet that fairly aggressive timeline, considering we're already, 4 months into 2025, and we expect you not to start construction until 2026. And all projects must have a willingness to work toward code and ADA compliance. We know a lot of historic buildings are not ADA compliant. We know it takes a lot of sensitive upgrades to get them there. We just want to know that projects and organizations are willing to move in that direction. And it's something that a lot of the other funders who tend to support these projects are looking for as well. And so just a reminder that DOE deadline is going to come up before we know it. So if you haven't talked to Elizabeth and you need to, make sure to do that sooner rather than later. She needs about 30 days to turn around those forms. That's why we have a deadline that's about 30 days in advance of the application deadline. Buildings that are determined eligible for listing on the National Register will need to be listed if you're selected for funding. But the good news there is that Preservation Trust of Vermont has some funding available through the administrative side of the Bruhn Grant program. So we will hire a consultant to do that National Register nomination. It will be covered with some of that administrative funding. It just needs to, we need to complete that process before you're able to close out your grant. And if your project is in line for funding, so if you are one of those projects that's been selected for funding, one of the earliest conversations we'll have with you, if you have a mortgage or a lien on your building, we'll be asking for a letter from your mortgage holder just accepting the terms of the easement. Because the easement, as we'll talk about in just a minute, it's a condition of this funding, and so it's one of those non-negotiable things that if it's going to be an issue, we want to know about it earlier in the process so we can try and navigate that with you all. And so, quick detour over into the world of architectural survey. The VARI form, the Vermont Architectural Resource Inventory, if you're doing a determination of eligibility for an individual building or potentially a district, you're going to fill out some variety of this form. And it's really just capturing the relevant information on the building. So, Elizabeth and the team over at the Division for Historic Preservation can decide whether or not the building meets kind of the criteria for the National Register. So you put in basic property information over on the left. You don't need to worry about this information up here at the top. You can figure out if the building's been listed to the state register by looking at the online resource center, and that's something that Elizabeth can help you with as well. Don't worry if you don't know the architect or engineer or the contractor that built the building. If you know that information, wonderful, include it, but don't get discouraged if you don't have every single detail. It's okay to have kind of a range for your building date. Buildings may be built in 1831 or they might be built, circa 1830. And then you're going to kind of move through some basic building material about your both building as in the structure and building as in the actual materials. Talking about your foundation, what is the building covered with? Is it brick? Does it have clapboard? What does the structural system look like? And, Elizabeth's here to help you. We're here to help you with this. We recognize that most of you are kind of lay people working through this process for the first time. And so really it's just kind of taking a step back and looking with your building and trying to do your best to document it. So architectural and structural description, you're going to essentially stand back and say, okay, what does my building look like? And there are wonderful resources online. There are both through the Online Resource Center. There are things like Buildings of Vermont, which is a great book. That information is also available online that can help give you that language to talk about your building. You're going to know if there are any other resources on the property. Is there a really wonderful garage? Is there a barn or other agricultural buildings that are worth noting? And then you're going to talk about the history of the building. So, when was it built? Have there been changes over time to it? Was it a church that became a performance hall in 1920? Was it a school that became a Grange Hall? Just kind of a basic overview of the history. Your local historical society or your local town history is a great place to kind of look for some of that information. And if you do lean on those, just make sure to cite them. You'll take a look at the environment. Is it part of a residential streetscape? Is it in an agricultural landscape? This is just kind of the basic starting block, so Elizabeth can then look at this information and photos and decide whether or not the building is going to be eligible for the National Register. So we'll veer back over to the Bruhn Grant program and just know that there'll be opportunities for questions in about 3 slides. So the easement. One of those screener questions is asking about the easement. The easement is a legal agreement put in place to protect the public investment in the building. And it's really a protection that's put in place to ensure that the work that happens beyond the grant is consistent with the goals of the original funding source. So in the case of preservation, this preservation easement is really focused on protecting those things about the building that make it really special and make sure that they're going to be there in the future. It's a requirement of the Historic Preservation Fund, that federal funding pot of money. And the term is linked to the amount of funding you receive. So a $50,000 grant has about a 5-year term, a $100,000 grant is going to be 10. The exterior will always be covered because that's always going to be kind of the publicly accessible piece of your building. The interior features are going to vary by project or vary by building. So if we're funding work on the interior, the easement will extend into the interior, or if your building, the interior is really significant to the overall importance of that building, we may need to protect some of those interior features as well. Um, the easement it really is a partnership between the Preservation Trust of Vermont, who holds the easement, and the owner. All work beyond regular maintenance needs to be approved by the Preservation Trust of Vermont. We have a staff person who does this a wonderful job of this, and really we are a preservation technical assistance provider. We are here to help you all plan these projects and make sure they meet the terms of the easement. We want to do this in partnership with you. And again, the guiding principle is that all of the work really needs to be following preservation best practices. There is a kind of easement template as part of the screener questions. It is also available at the top of the application. I encourage you all to take a look at that. We have easement information on our website. I'm happy to answer any kind of big picture easement questions. If you have really kind of project specific questions, I can also put you in touch with Meg Campbell, who is our VP and easement coordinator, and she can kind of talk through what that would look like for your particular building and project. And this is as I mentioned, this is it's a requirement of the funder. It is not something we have any wiggle room on. And if you accept the funding, we're going to have you sign the easement pretty early in the process, and it will be recorded at the end. And that recording has to go through, or we would unfortunately have to take that funding back. And so we really want to make sure that groups understand what the easement means and that they're on board early in the process. And so we don't have any surprises kind of later on in the grant cycle. And last but not least, eligible activities. We try and cast a pretty wide net with what the Bruhn funds can pay for. But we like to call it kind of our capital P preservation money. It's money that's coming from the National Park Service, which is like the federal entity that's working on historic preservation. And so we really are looking for those classic preservation projects, window restoration, slate roof work, exterior work, but we also love to pair it with things that we know really can improve the usability of a building. So, we fund window restoration, structural work, restoration of exterior and interior features, code compliance work, weatherization improvements. So storm windows and window restoration can be a really wonderful pairing. We know that, interior plaster work frequently goes hand in hand with sensitive weatherization efforts and insulation. Those are things that we're, excited to find ways to both accomplish the preservation goals while also making the building more usable. So, projects that will be most successful, I think, are projects that are preservation focused and preservation forward, that are focusing on historic materials, features, and finishes, and really that have done good planning to identify this as a need and have a clear scope of work of how you're going to accomplish that goal. And so we're going to take a quick pit stop and see if there are any questions that we should address now before we move on to the next section about the application. So if you've got questions, Denise, are there any questions in the chat box we need to touch?
There's a question about a specific bridge in Marshfield that's in the floodplain, and would an elevated walkway from the parking lot to the bridge be an eligible project?
Let's talk about that towards the end because that's a very project specific thing. I will say the National Park Service has put together a series of different guidelines of guidelines on sustainability, but there is also one on kind of flood resiliency. And so with those types of projects, we would really be looking at, like, is this a great fit for our funding source, but also is this work going to be done in a manner that's consistent with preservation best practices? But we really do have some good guidance on that, which is great.
There's also a question on if the building can be town owned.
Yes, buildings can be municipally owned. They can be owned by a 501c organization. They can be privately owned so long as they're in those downtowns and designated village centers. And I would say private ownership is probably the area that kind of catches things that might fall somewhere in between, whether it's a co-op or an LL, a multi-person LLC. We really we have yet to find an ownership type that we won't want fund with our expanded ownership eligibility. But I'd say if you feel like you don't quite fit into any of those categories, reach out and we can have a conversation. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi, thank you. I just have a question, really just clarification around that easement.
Mhm.
Is that just like so that you guys can anytime just come and inspect it? Or I guess like what would the purpose of the easement be for?
So the easement, it is a legal agreement, so it's recorded in the deed. It'll run with the land for the term of the easement. It is not designed so we can pop in at any moment and be like, oh, we see that you have violated the terms of your easement. It's not at all what we're looking to do. Meg Campbell, our easement coordinator, does do annual stewardship visits, but we really view it as an opportunity to walk through the building together and say, what do you have planned for the next year? Like, let's have these conversations now so you're able to plan and move forward with work. So you never get caught being like, oh man, we should have asked PTV to talk about this. I mean, at the root of it, it is a legal obligation, but we really like to view it as an opportunity to like work collaboratively with you all. Um, we don't want to be the preservation police. It's not what we're looking to do with this. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Yeah, I have a client that is looking to, this was something she had mentioned, and I just want to make sure I'm explaining it to them correctly. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jenna, there's one more question on if foundation work is eligible.
Foundation work would be eligible. It's important to consider with something like that that there's going to be ground disturbance associated with it. And so we'll want to be thinking about any potential archaeological resources and if there would need to be an additional layer of planning for that. But we have certainly funded foundation work in the past.
Um, uh, I have a question. You talked about improving the usability of the building.
Mhm.
Would that include certain modern business or modern building systems like plumbing and heating, even though they're not historically accurate?
Yes, so the standards for rehabilitation that we follow for the Bruhn grants certainly allow for mechanical, electrical, plumbing improvements to building. Really, buildings need to be used, and we don't want to pickle them. And so, certainly, those types of improvements will be eligible. We're looking at for this grant program, like how are those systems going to be installed, and what kind of impacts are we looking at in terms of interior? And one of the other things that we'll talk about in just a minute is kind of eligibility versus competitiveness. And one of the factors we do consider when we're looking at projects are there other resources available to fund this type of work? And so there are things like the Downtown and Village Center tax credit program that can fund code compliance improvements. There are other type like USDA rural development, which has become more of a question mark in the recent months. So it is absolutely an eligible project type. We'll kind of look at your application and figure out how it checks all of the other boxes too.
Jenna, would you like to take more questions now or save them for a little later?
I would say if someone has a question really about those first few things that we talked about, let's take one more now and then we'll have some more time as we go.
Okay, well, there's one on ownership. Can a project start under municipal ownership and then change to 501c3 ownership during the course of the project?
Yep, that would be fine. And Mark, I see you've got your hand up too, so go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Jenna. Yeah, this is Mark from Chandler Center of the Arts in Randolph. So I have two questions. The first is if you have an easement or agreement already with PTV in place, we have a long history with you folks, and we're very grateful for that. Do if we if we apply for a new grant, do we have to establish a new easement, or can we use what's in place already?
There would be an extension of the term of the easement. If theoretically you had a term easement in place, we would then have to extend that term based on the amount of additional funding that has been awarded.
Okay.
The one exception to that is if you have a Vermont Housing and Conservation Board easement, which is a perpetual easement, the Bruhn, that covers the requirements of the Bruhn easement. And so that kind of takes care of it for us.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. So we've chatted a little bit kind of already, the screener questions that you all will answer as the kind of initial basic eligibility criteria. This is our landing page on the website that you'll come to. The screener questions are a series, I think it's 7 or 8 questions that we've touched on. In order to access the application, the answer to all of those questions has to be yes. So if you were to check, no, my property is not listed on the National Register and I'm not willing to get it listed, or, work on my project has already started, you're going to get a notification that says, like, we're sorry, you're not eligible to apply for funding. Please contact a field service rep. And so that's kind of the basic thing that you should know of. Like, if you're getting an ineligibility response, it's because something on that eligibility checklist is not working out correctly. We're happy to answer questions about that. If you really just want to get a look at the applications and the questions, feel free to fill it out. Click yes, move along. Just know that, like, we ask those questions at the beginning for a reason. And so, like, if the answer to one of them really is a no, this is not a great source of funding for your project. So you're going to fill that out, and down at the bottom there will be a submit button. You'll click that, give it a second, and then you'll move on to the application page. And there is a series of, here, before we do that, before we move on to the actual application, we'll go back to what I had touched on a little earlier, this idea of eligible versus competitive. And so one of the things we will share with you when we send out the PDF slides is our selection criteria. And I've realized in putting all of this information together that that is not actually linked on our website. And so we'll be doing that as well. All of the projects that say yes to the eligibility questions are eligible to apply. And then really there are a series of, I believe, 7 questions that we score on. So, 20 points, 10 points. And then there's 8 or so weighted considerations looking at geographic distribution of projects, project type, other funding sources. And it's the combination of those 2 things that helps our review panel make decisions on whether or not a project is going to be selected for funding. I encourage you all to take a look at that and really self-score and self-weight about where you think you land in this, how your board capacity is looking, how you're looking in terms of like funding sources that you have secured. Because the goal of the Bruhn Grant program is to create or enhance community and economic development of opportunities, there's 40 points associated with those questions. Because this is a preservation funding source, we are looking for well-planned preservation forward projects. 20 points of your score is associated with like the scope of work and whether or not it follows preservation best practices. And there's additional points kind of tied back into that. Timeline, as I mentioned, has become even more important as we make sure we're sticking to our approved period of performance. And, part of what will weigh on that process is, are you applying for a project? Have you secured your other funding sources, or are you looking ahead to the fall of 2025 or even 2026 before you're going to have that budget in place to be able to move forward with your project? So those are all things that we're taking into consideration as we're looking at your application. And as we go through the application questions, I've noted on the slides, like, this question is related to these scoring criteria. And so that's something that as you're working through, you can go back and reference if that feels helpful. So you know how you're answering, how it's tied into our decision-making process. We really want to be as transparent as we can when we're making these funding decisions. And so when you get to the application, there's a few things up the top. There's like 2 sentences, and it's actually packed with information. Important dates are linked there. Our program requirements are there. So if you receive funding, here are all of the things that you need to do while this grant is active, both to start your project and get it moving in the regulatory process, but also here are the steps you need to take to draw down funds. Here's how you close your grant out. All of that's kind of laid out at the beginning. The terms of the easement are also there as well. And the one that you all will need to download and use is the Excel budget sheet. So I encourage you to explore all of those. You have to do the Excel as an attachment and upload it. So just know that that one all the way over here on the right will need to be downloaded and saved. And so there's a basic kind of chunk of information at the top of the application. And this is all just kind of your project basics. Project name, organization, location, all of these things. But I do want to bring your attention to something down at the bottom of that box. You have the ability to save your application, but in order to save it, you need to put in an email address. And so one of the first things you should do is to put in the contact email address here. And that way, when you're ready, down at the bottom of the application, you can hit save and continue later. I don't have a secret magic backdoor to these applications. And so if you don't put an email address in it, or if it's not saved, that information will be lost. And so it's really important that you put information in, that you put your email in, that you save it. And I also always encourage groups answer your questions in a Word doc or something else, and then copy and paste those bigger answers in so you're not at risk of losing everything if your computer all of a sudden shuts down. We've run into issues in the past, and it's always really terrible when folks think that I have some way to pull things back from the internet underworld, and I really don't. So yes, Janet, go ahead.
Just a quick question because somebody is hiring me to do this.
Mhm.
So I know like every portal is different. Um, if I put in their email address, will I still be able to access it, or like does it send you a link? Like how does that work? Or should I just do complete? Because I don't know if I completely do it in a Word document and just give them that if they
Mhm.
would be able to. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think you could put in their email address. It will generate a link and email the application to them. But when you do that, it will also give you a link on the home screen. And so you'll have access to that link, and they would theoretically have access to their link. Or you could use your email address there, especially while you're moving through this saving process. And then when you do the final submit, you could swap your email out and put their email in, which might be a way of kind of like keeping it out of their inbox until they're really ready to see it.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jenna, there's a few questions waiting in the chat. Would you like to answer them now or later?
Sure. Yeah, let's do a couple now.
Okay. If a group already has a letter stating the building is eligible to be listed on the National Register, do they need to go through that process again by April 30th?
No, if you already have a letter, and I would say as long as that letter was done in the past few years, you can upload that letter as your attachment.
And if the building is town-owned, would it be okay for a community 501c3 to apply for the grant, or should the town be the applicant?
The 501c3 can be the applicant. They will just need to have something in writing from the town signing off saying that the town agrees to the terms of the easement,
Okay.
which is one of the attachments that will be included at the bottom of the application.
And a question about ADA, when do ADA and code compliance come into play?
For ADA, all of it comes into play now. I mean, your buildings, if they're not code compliant and they're not ADA compliant, you're open to those violations. With ADA, as long as you're working towards solutions and you have documentation of that, you're usually in pretty good shape. I would say if you have concerns about life and safety code, you should contact your local code official and walk through the building with them now just to make sure that you're able to continue operating before you make any updates, because I am not a code official, so I cannot say what is and is not allowable to have people in a building. For the Janet, do you have another question, or is that just a leftover? Okay, great. So for first question, historic resource description. really, we are looking for, what is historically significant about your building? Is it listed on the state or national register? Is it locally significant? Um, it 4 to 5 sentences, this is not a huge text box, but really we're trying to understand like why is this building worthy of preservation? How does it fit into the surrounding, built and cultural landscape? Why is it important through that lens? Every project is going to look a little different. The Sandboard Bridge is Linden it's actually nationally significant as one of the few remaining examples of a paddleford truss, which is a very specific type of, covered bridge truss system. The Arlington Performance Arts Hall, it's a mid-century former Catholic church, which is a resource type we don't have a lot of in Vermont. The Fletcher Memorial Library in Ludlow is a, beautiful example of a little Beaux-Arts library with exceptional interior finishes. The Guyan Valley Hall is a community Grange hall with very vernacular architecture, but a really wonderful kind of social and community history. All of these resources have different levels of architectural significance, and all of them are important, and we want to know about what makes your building special. For rural community impact, we want to know what's special about this building from the community's standpoint. How do they use this building? How will the proposed project help them continue to use this building and help keep that community vitality and identity alive? How will it enhance the lives of future generations? For private property owners, obviously your answer to this is going to look a little different. Your take on rural community impact is not going to look the same as a library or a town hall or those community gathering places. But I would say we certainly see privately owned historic resources in community centers that serve a very similar role. So just know we're looking for like how your building benefits the community. What is that connection? And so 3 to 5 sentences, scoring criteria 1, 2, and 8. And I believe 8, we talk about like, is this a transformational project for a community? This is where you have the opportunity to tell us about that. So as a preservation funding source, this is kind of like our big question that we're looking for information on. So we're looking for a description of the work. We want to know how you identified these issues and how what you're proposing will comply or align with the Secretary's standards. And it's important to know, and this we'll hit on many times throughout the presentation, work funded by the Bruhn grant and all other work that's happening on the building while the grant is active, it all needs to meet the Secretary's standards. The National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office look at the total impact on the building when they're reviewing it, not just where our funding happens to be going. 10 to 12 sentences for this question, so it's a big one. Scoring criteria related to kind of architectural values, your planning, and kind of your how ready you are to move through the grant making process. The standards for rehabilitation, there's to geek out in preservation world for a moment. There are 4 sets of standards. The standards for rehabilitation are the ones that we focus on. They're the ones that are really focused on allowing buildings to continue to be used and well loved, recognizing that there needs to be modest changes that happen in that process. Code compliance, ADA, additions, all of those things happen, and they all happen with kind of the guidance of the standards. We're not going to read through all of them because nobody loves to read through a slide full of text. There are 10 standards, which are kind of like your guiding principles when planning a preservation project. They're broad enough to apply to all projects, but I'd encourage you all to either talk to us or get to know yourselves the standards, but also the Park Service has done a really nice job putting together this guidelines for rehabilitating historic buildings and really goes work item by work item of like when you're working on historic windows, here are recommended treatment options and here are not recommended treatment options. And this is everything from masonry work, structural work, new additions. It's all kind of laid out about how to plan a good preservation project. And we're, PTV has field service staff who can help answer some of these questions. For some of you, you have been working with us for a while and you have conditions assessment from preservation-focused architects and contractors that have helped you really plan for this project. This is where you get to tell us all of that. And so the level of planning is going to tie closely to the complexity of your project. You know, if you're doing a slate roof replacement, really us knowing some information about your building, some really good photos showing us that the roof is no longer in good condition, an estimate, a clear estimate from a contractor kind of telling us about the work that's going to be done, and referencing back to these kind of basic preservation materials, whether their preservation briefs or the standards. That just lets us know that you've done your homework and you really understand how to do this work in a way that's consistent with the standards, which makes for a really easy review process with the Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office. And I recognize you all don't have to be experts in this field to put it together. We're here to help you kind of make those decisions about like, oh, this is the type of work you're hoping to do. These are the type of resources you should really be looking at while you're putting your plans together. If you're looking to do structural work, having drawings from an engineer will be very important. There are lots of different ways to do projects, and knowing that what you're proposing is consistent with the standards is really important for us as a review panel. And then there are also kind of really niche projects, like some really high, historic finishes like mosaic flooring. It's not just as much about identifying the issue, but having a plan of how to address the issue. And so, for the Fletcher Memorial Library in Ludlow, they recognized that their mosaic flooring in their vestibule had been damaged over time, likely by salt coming in off the street. They found a firm who could help them really understand those materials and come up with a plan. And so when they came to us for funding, they had this very clear, here's where we're going to start and here's how we're going to get to the end. And that made it for very competitive for funding, but also very easy to get it through the review process. And we're coming back again to that kind of overarching question of what the Bruhn grant review will cover. So it's going to cover funded work, coordinated work. It's going to fund unexpected things that come up over the life of your project, or if there are funding sources that come in later in the project timeline. Really thinking about it as like, when we award funding in July, all the way through June of 2027, we need to be thinking very carefully about the work that's being done on the building and making sure that we're kind of getting the proper approvals for that. I will say it is much easier to have things come up post-review. So once the Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office has signed off and said, yes, your scope of work looks great. If you find something unexpected, they already have a great frame of reference for your project. And really, it's about giving them a little more information on this unexpected thing that has come up. It's a lot harder to have unexpected things bubbling up during the review process because they're trying to piece together what your project is, and having information continuously flow and change makes that really difficult. So like when we think about the timelines, when projects are under review, we don't want a whole lot to change. We want to be pretty consistent with our scope of work. And then when you get started, just knowing that like PTV is there to help you navigate anything unexpected that you find, to make sure that you all are able to move through your projects smoothly, and that, both you and PTV are kind of meeting our grant obligations. And again, tying back to the purpose of the Bruhn Grant Program, we want to know about kind of the new or increased economic development opportunities that this project will bring to your community. If the economic development opportunities already exist, we want to know why these funds are really important to ensuring that those activities can continue. So in Bridgewater, this is a community center, but this project also created early childhood education slots, which we all know is really important for community and economic development. The New Avenue project in St. Johnsbury rehabbed commercial space, created housing units, and this is a key downtown property that when positive things are happening here, there are positive ripple effects that come out of it. In Guilford, the Broadbrook Grange, this is a true community center. There are Grange suppers, but there's also, Winter's farmers markets and wellness classes. And this building supports this community of small entrepreneurs that now have a place to be able to offer their services on a regular basis. And the Northfield Gray building, this is a building where that economic activity already exists. There's office space, there's community space, there's a school, and they needed help with their exterior envelope. They needed help ensuring that that community and economic activity could continue to happen and continue to happen in an affordable way, because we recognize that many of these buildings are large. These projects are really expensive, and the Bruhn funds can help bring that into a reasonable amount so groups can continue to offer these really important services while also tackling kind of these big rehabilitation projects. This is your opportunity to tell us about ownership. This is where if a 501c3 is applying on behalf of the municipality, or if there's anything funky about the ownership, this is your place to tell us. We're going to ask if there's a mortgage or lien on the property, which we mentioned earlier, because if there is, we're going to need to check with your mortgage holder before we finalize funding. If you're anticipating ownership to change in the next few months, if there's anything like that, that it would be really helpful for us to know and understand, this is that place for you to give us that information. We're going to ask for a decent amount of information on your working group. And this, of all the questions, is probably, it's really bulleted, and we're asking for some very specific information about like your experience with previous federal funding or other comparable funding sources, your financial stability, and your accounting systems. These questions, for the most part, they're letting us know about capacity, but they're also, feeds a lot of our risk assessment information that we have to process. And so really we're looking at, it's okay to have different levels of risk between our applicants and our subgrantees. We just need to have a good understanding of what those potential risks are and how much oversight might be needed. We recognize that there's a wide variety of accounting systems in places with small organizations. Some groups have automated accounting systems. Some groups have a treasurer and a checkbook, and that's how they do business. And that's okay. We've just really been finding, as we've done multiple years of this program, want to make sure you have kind of clear accounting practices to make sure as we're trying to process reimbursements, we have a clear picture of your expenses. We have a clear picture of how they were paid out. And I'm realizing I'm going slow, so I'm going to start picking up the pace a little bit too. So project timeline, which we've alluded to a little bit, we're in the application cycle right now, which will run into July. Once funding is in place for these projects, we'll move you all into this regulatory review process, which we anticipate taking from this summer through the end of the calendar year. This is federal funding, and so there has to be some kind of competitive procurement process. And so we expect procurement, going out to bid will happen in the spring of next year. If your project doesn't go into the queue until October or November, you're not going to come out of the queue in January. You're going to come out in, March or April. And so this timeline might shift a little bit. But this is kind of like in the ideal world, we're getting projects in and you're going to be coming out and starting construction, next spring, next summer, wrapping up work in June through September. June is our deadline. June of 27 is what we will put in our grant agreements. Preservation Trust of Vermont has to close our grants by September of 2027. So there is this buffer, but we also need time to wrap up all of the administrative pieces. And so we're shooting for June. If you plan on starting construction in 2025, Bruhn is not a good fit for you because of this kind of longer regulatory timeline. I would love to say that we could give you funding in July and you could be starting work in October. We have just, over the past 5 rounds, we have just seen that is not going to happen. And, we don't want to be the reason that your project's not able to move forward. We also recognize that the staff at the Park Service is under a lot of strain with their review queues, and that we are one of 45 active sub-grant programs running right now. And that is only one of the many programs that they have to review. And so we really try and hold up our end of the bargain and build enough time into our timelines to allow for these reviews to happen. So we'll take Like maybe one or two questions, Denise, and then we'll keep going.
We have a few in the chat. Would this grant be suitable for an unusable building to stabilize a building that's currently unusable?
We could fund stabilization work. I think we would really be looking for a solid plan of how you're going to move from stabilization to public use. We wouldn't want to fund something and then not have that public use and public access happen for, an unforeseeable amount of time.
And could this grant be used to purchase a historic building in conjunction with beginning a construction phase?
Bruhn funds only fund construction. We do not fund acquisition. So the group would need to purchase the building and then we could potentially fund work on it.
Okay. And is there support available for grant writing?
If you, yes, there is support available for grant writing. I hope between the webinar and with Denise and my help, you don't need a grant writer to use the Bruhn grant application. We have tried to make it easy enough for most people to be able to access. If you need help, and you're a 501c3 or a municipality or a local agricultural business, and if you are located in a community of 5,000 or less, the Vermont Housing Conservation Board READY's program may be able to help you. But we really, I hope with some support from PTV staff, you'll be able to navigate the grant application without outside support.
Ready is approving, I don't know all, but they are definitely offering funds for this grant.
Yep, right. The budget, everybody's favorite thing. So I don't know how many of you may have previously applied to Bruhn and this you're coming back and reapplying. We do have a budget sheet this year as opposed to just a text box. We're hoping that will help us get some more detailed information on the project budget. Apologies, my voice is starting to get a little scratchy. For Bruhn, grant award ranges from $50,000 to $100,000. Your grant request can be anywhere between those two numbers. We're going to ask you for your total project cost. So what is the thing we're funding? Are there matching funds? Is there other work happening at the same time that's really part of your project? Bruhn supports construction, but the total project cost can include soft costs, so architecture, engineering, permitting, those things that make a project run but aren't construction. And you can, and we would encourage you for most projects to include some sort of contingency. And so you're going to click on that budget Excel on our website. You're going to download it and save it to your computer. This is kind of your blank budget, and you can see there's these red boxes, and this is not the Excel, so it's not going to work the same way. But if you hover over those, there will be kind of guidance, about the maximum contingency amount, the soft cost one. Soft costs, not every Bruhn project will have soft costs, but if this is a complex project where we're talking about a whole building rehabilitation where you're really touching all of the different services and systems and finishes. If you're making changes to a floor plan, so if you're doing or putting in systems that would impact it, like we want to see plans for sprinkler systems, MEP system updates, additions, all of those things that will impact kind of the footprint of the historic building. You're likely going to want some kind of architect to be involved. If you have complex and overlapping disciplines where you need an engineer to be able to say, yes, the structural load of the second floor is sufficient for public use. Okay, the architect has designed where the bathroom and the systems are going to go. Those are where the soft costs become very important and where we just want to make sure that you all are aware of kind of all of the expenses that will be associated with your project. But if you're, for instance, you're doing a roof replacement, as long as you know that your roof is structurally sound, you're probably not going to have a lot of those soft costs. You may have the estimate from the roofing contractor of $125,000. You're asking for 75 from Bruhn. You have 50,000 of other funding, and you're putting in a 10% contingency, which is covered by that other funding. that may be your total expenses, and that is okay. It is really as we get into those more complex projects that we're going to be looking at those soft costs. And down at the bottom of the budget, we're going to look at your funding sources. So for a slate roof replacement, we've got, the Bruhn grant, which is federal funding. And so we've kind of grayed out these other areas. Division for Historic Preservation, which is our state historic preservation grant, $20,000. That's non-federal, planning to apply in October. And town funds that have been secured, maybe at town meeting this year or last year. And so you've marked that with a yes, and you've just indicated secure. And so we're always looking to make sure that A, you have enough funding to cover the project costs that you have identified in your budget. And in this instance, this is a make-believe project, but this project has a little bit of a cushion with those town funds, which is really helpful. And then if the slate roof is really part of this larger project, so it's a town hall with an open kind of performance space on the second floor. They're coming to Bruhn asking for money to support the slate roof work. But really, there's fire suppression, there's ADA, there's wastewater that needs to happen so more people can use this building. So there's an upgrade to the septic, and there's plaster work. And so there's all of these other expenses and all of these other disciplines that are overlapping. And so their group is building in a 10% or so contingency, and they're also budgeting about 10% of their total construction costs for soft costs. That between planning the new addition and all of the other systems, the architect and engineering fees, and then about, a small percentage for permitting here. And so a much bigger total budget. We see that this group is aware of kind of the planning costs that are going to be necessary to get enough information to the Park Service and the state for review. And then in their budget, they have a much longer list of funding sources, a mixture of federal and non-federal, some of which are secure, some of which are not, but a pretty clear plan of like, here's what we're applying for, here's what we've secured, and here's kind of our goal for private fundraising, which we plan to have done by the end of the year. Matching funds for Bruhn provide a competitive advantage during the application review process. However, matching funds are not required. The Preservation Trust of Vermont has to provide a certain dollar amount of matching funds to the Park Service, and that cannot be federal funds. And so those non-federal matching funds, we need to get those come from the projects. And depending on the projects that are in line to receive funding, maybe all of those matching funds are coming from one or two projects. Maybe it's spread out across 5 or 6. It varies widely from grant round to grant round, but just know that if you have a $100,000 project and you have a $25,000 non-federal matching fund, and you're stacked up against an identical project that's asking for $100,000 of Bruhn funds with no match, in all likelihood, that project with that non-federal match that's equal in every other category, that non-federal match is going to be the little boost that kind of bumps you up. There, down at the bottom of the budget, there's some notes on kind of federal, non-federal. So sources of federal funding that cannot be included as match, but should be included in your budget. The one exception there is HUD CDBG, which in Vermont is the Vermont Community Development Program. HUD can match Bruhn, which is, I don't know why that is, but it's great. And then non-federal really captures everything else. So state tax credits, local fundraising, municipal funds, state grants, those are all your non-federal matching sources. Non-federal, federal match, all of those different acronyms, it's an alphabet soup. We mix them up sometimes and we live in this world. Feel free to reach out if you have questions about your budget. Budgets are tricky when you're balancing lots of funding sources and expensive in particular. I know sometimes that can be a challenge, and we're happy to kind of help answer those basic questions. After you fill out your Excel sheet, there's a budget narrative. So really tell us about the numbers that are in your budget. Talking about that non-federal, federal match, funds that are secured versus unsecured. And again, thinking about that pretty accelerated timeline. Funds in hand are great. If funds aren't in hand, when do you plan on apply for them? When will you be informed of that? we also want to know what happens if you run into unexpected work or you have, if your budget is going over. Is it how do you plan on kind of covering that? Our grant max is $100,000. We don't have the ability to add supplemental funds, and so we really want to know, especially in this kind of construction climate, what happens if something goes over budget. And then there'll be one last question down at the bottom. Do you plan on applying for federal historic tax credits? If you do, that's totally fine. We just like to ensure that we coordinate regulatory reviews very early in the process. And then all the way at the bottom are attachments. So scoring criteria 4 and 6 talk about, your plans and how well developed they are. And so if you have a simple project and you just have an estimate from a contractor, making sure that that estimate is from someone who's preservation focused, and so that the work they're describing in that estimate is something that the reviewers are going to feel comfortable approving. If you have a more complex rehabilitation project and you do have that architect and engineer who you are working with, you need to have 50% drawings to be kind of competitive in the application process. That's schematic level drawings. And if you don't have them, or if you have them, we really need you to be looking to have 75% drawings by the end of the year. And I know those numbers don't make sense to you unless you're like in the middle of a rehab project, but really it's like making sure that you're getting from the big picture schematic design phase to a point in the planning process where there is enough information about how all of these other pieces will fit together. Not every project is going to have this level of planning, but if you're one of those bigger construction projects, this is going to be kind of the world in which you're living for the next 6 or 8 months. And it can take a really long time to get a project from idea to conceptual design to 75% drawings, and 75% is what we need to begin the regulatory process. So if you're too early in that timeline, it's going to be really hard for you to meet that June 2027 deadline. If you're one of those more complex projects, I'm happy to kind of chat with you where you are in your planning timeline. It just, those numbers, they're important in terms of like us being able to move the project along. You have to save and upload your budget. Photos, we ask for 5, and I know that's really hard because sometimes you have a lot of them. One picture of the property and then one picture of the property kind of within the streetscape so we can see the surrounding resources. And then photos of the work that you're hoping to complete with the Bruhn grant funds. If your building has been determined eligible for listing, you need to upload that determination. If your building is already listed, you do not need to upload the National Register nomination. Those can be really big files. It's going to be really hard for you to upload, so don't worry about that. You're going to reference the listing in that first question, so you don't need to upload the nomination. And then last but not least, if you're one of those applicants who does not own the building, you'll need to upload kind of proof in writing, whether it's a letter or meeting minutes from the select board meeting where they vote to say, yes, we agree to the terms of the easement. We have to be sure that that can move forward. And so having groups kind of really sign on to it as part of the application process is key. If you do not own the building and you submit your application without that approval in writing, we will not consider your application complete and we will not be able to consider it for funding. So please just, keep an eye on that timeline. I know select boards meet once or twice a month. Just make sure you have the opportunity to have that conversation and get that taken care of. And then you don't want to upload your attachments until you're ready to submit. Attachments don't save with your application. So this will be the last thing that you upload before you hit submit. And just a reminder of how important pictures can be, back to Braintree Hill Meeting House. If this is the picture that you give us, oh my gosh, what a beautiful resource. But you can't see that the roof is actually in really bad shape. When you get those photos that show you the condition of the roof, and that combined with the estimate from the contractor, that gives us an enormous amount of information about current conditions and need. So really don't underestimate the value of good photos. I know the weather has been questionable these past few weeks, and so perhaps, especially if you're thinking about outside work, wait until there's not snow on the ground around your foundation, or don't take the pictures on a day where there's snow on the roof. We're building nerds. We want to really see what you're looking to try and address, and so just make sure that that's clear in the pictures. So the application review, same as the overall program review, but just a reminder of kind of where we are. DOE deadline end of the month. We'll be making funding decisions in July. If we have, when applications are due, we'll do a cursory review of completeness. If it looks like there was an issue with an upload or something, we'll reach out, we'll ask for additional information. And then that way we know when we take the projects to the review panel, everything is in place. The one thing that we will not follow up on is that approval of the easement in writing. So just one more warning about that. And for those of you that are familiar with federal funding, bless your hearts for doing it. It can be really complicated. For those of you that aren't, I'm happy to kind of have an additional conversation because I know that there are a lot of complexities to federal funding that are really hard to understand until you're in it. I think the really wonderful thing about the Bruhn Grant Program is that we are a partner in this, and hopefully we are able to help you navigate this whole process, that it doesn't fall on you to do it all by yourselves. Um, if you if you're a municipality or a nonprofit, you probably already have a unique identity identifier, a UEI. If you don't and you're in line to receive funding, you will need to obtain one, even if you're a private property owner. You have to have a UEI to do business with the federal government, and federal grants fall into that category. You have to complete a NEPA, which is a National Environmental Policy Act review, which kind of takes into consideration the impacts on the environment, which includes historic resources. And you have to do a Section 106 review. Those are done by the National Park Service and the state. This is why that review process takes so long. PTV helps you assemble all of the information you need to complete that review. But just know that that's why we say you can't do any work on the building until you've completed that review process. You have to follow federal procurement requirements, which means for contracts of less than $250,000, there's like a smaller, lower bar for soliciting a certain number of bids and making sure that there's a competitive process there. For projects over $250,000, you're really looking at a sealed bid scoring selection process. It's all laid out in federal statute, but it's also all included in those program requirements on the application page in kind of a distilled, here's what it looks like based on the size of your project. So I encourage you to check that out. We'll be there to help you navigate that. It's just good to know that you can't take this grant award, pick one contractor and give them that contract. It has to be kind of an open and competitive process. Like I shouldn't say all, most grant programs, this is a reimbursement grant program. So the project has to incur expenses before we can pay grant funding out. I will say that the Bruhn grant funds are the quickest federal funds that I have ever worked with. Once you incur expenses and you pass those along to PTV, we can draw funds within days and we can get that check out to you. So like a very quick turnaround between when you incur the expense and when we're paying out that money. But as you'll see kind of on the slide and in the program requirements, there are percentage points along the way. So we can release up to 50% of your grant award after you complete the administrative steps and you've kind of incurred, in all likelihood, up to $50,000 worth of costs, which especially with bigger projects and deposits, that happens. We can release another 30% when your project is 75% complete, but we cannot release the final 20% until the project is closed out, the easement is recorded, the National Register nomination has been approved. And so we can help with money throughout the grant, but that money is not fronted. And so most projects, even smaller projects, either have to have a pretty clear payment plan or some source of short-term construction or bridge financing. And Preservation Trust of Vermont, we are a prime grantee. We have a direct relationship with the Park Service, and then we work with our sub-grantees to help them all navigate these rules and these processes. You all are responsible for that. We are responsible for ensuring compliance with that. It is a relationship and we are all doing the very best we can, but I think it's important for sub-grantees to know that there are responsibilities and rules they have to follow with this grant funding, and that PTV we're going to do our best to help you navigate that. But they're there and they're real, And there are some like the easement that are just, there's no wiggle room on, which, so, and those are spelled out pretty clearly in our program requirements. Happy to talk to folks that are kind of new to this world, really to help you wrap your heads around the wonderfulness of this money, but also the strings that can come along with it. Which brings us to the very end of our long explanation of the program and application. Just a reminder that it's recorded and you'll get the slides. And so even if you feel like you've been absolutely inundated with information, you'll be able to go back and revisit all of that. So my contact information is on the screen. Denise's contact information is on the screen. I'll close the slideshow and we can kind of go out so I can see you all. I have a very limited view. And then we will start doing some questions and answers. So let's start.
Yeah.
So I'd say if you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand because you'll show up in order on my screen. And maybe Denise, we can go back and forth between the chat bar and folks on the screen that have questions. Okay.
Janet?
So yeah, Janet, and then Rich, I see your hand go up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything about the typical like BABA requirements. I did see that there's the federal procurement required, like Section 3, Davis-Bacon, those types of things.
Davis-Bacon does not apply. BABA applies to contracts of more than $250,000. Smaller projects have been given a waiver by the Department of Interior, and given the scale of our grant awards, most of those projects fall under that, BABA is not required at this point.
Okay, I did have one other question, but what was, give me 1 second. Let me just go back and look. Oh, no, I think you answered that one already. Thank you.
You're welcome. Rich?
Yeah, in Marshall, we have a covered bridge. I think it was the first only agricultural covered bridge in the state, and it's been on the historic National Register since '74, and it's in a flood zone. And if the floods we had, a couple years ago were took out some of our regular bridges, and that bridge actually stayed fine. It was elevated some, but the area around it gets flooded, and there's a pathway a gravel pathway that goes from the parking lot to the bridge, and it constantly gets, even on minor flooding, it will get, flooded and there'll be silt all over it. And we've had some FEMA money to help with some stuff, but like they'll just say, put down more gravel, which doesn't really, and what I was thinking would be really good was an elevated walkway, a couple feet high, a couple feet off the ground. It would probably make it more ADA accessible, since it's not gravel. You could put handrails on it and that kind of thing. Is that type of thing that you keep referring to buildings and, bridge is not a building.
Yep. So bridges are eligible, but I should say we always say buildings. Structures also fall into that category. We have funded a covered bridge in Linden. I would think, it's definitely an odd project. I think it would fall into the category of eligible under code compliance. I would probably put it in the same area as like a new addition where it's compatible new construction to improve the usability of that bridge. And new additions are eligible. They are not as competitive as if you were actually doing work on that bridge. It may be possible, given the scoring criteria and all of those other weighted considerations, that you could still bump up, but I do think it's important to know that it would not be as competitive as if you were working on the bridge itself.
Yeah, that kind of answers no use trying to work on something that's not going to get anywhere. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then from the chat, we have a question. Is a USDA loan a lien?
Like a previous USDA loan, I would think that would fall into the category of lien. I could confirm that with Meg. So why don't you go ahead and send us that question in writing to Jenna or Denise at ptv.org.
And then will the grant cover soft costs?
No, the grant only covers construction costs, but soft costs should be included in your budget.
And
Tracy. Oh, sorry, Denise. I'm going to skip
oh
to
no, you go
then we'll
ahead.
come back.
That's
Yeah.
okay. Um, uh, Given that this is a reimbursement situation, does Vermont already have this money in hand, or is there a chance that you could spend these funds and then the reimbursement money is not there, as has happened to farmers?
It's an excellent question. Preservation Trust of Vermont does not have this money. It has been obligated to us. It sits in our account at Treasury, but it is not in our bank account. And the what happened with the National Endowment for the Humanities funds or the USDA funds that could happen to the Bruhn funds. We keep an exceptionally close eye on all of this. I'm very aware of where my projects are in the construction process and when they need to draw down funds. Um, if that was to happen, all I could assure you of is that PTV would be a partner in helping our projects navigate what that looked like. Um, but that's all I can give you on that like particular question. Denise.
A question from the chat. We answered about the competitive bid. So the next question is the timeline indicated a tight time period to complete the work. Have existing grantees found it difficult to find contractors on a timely basis?
Um, most of our projects have been able to find contractors to do the work. We have had one or two really niche projects where they have had to go with a specialized contractor or company that has really helped, pushed their timeline out. I think it's a good idea to be having informal conversations with folks if you are awarded this funding and kind of start socializing the project, recognizing that you're not going to go out to bid until you've completed the review process. So we have been able to navigate the tight timelines. Um, if for some reason you were not able to find a contractor, if you went out to bid, if no one responded, if we tried to do more legwork and it wasn't successful, I think we would be there with you to try and pivot and figure out how to make it work within the allowable timeline.
And the grant proposal includes several distinct projects. Examples would be a ramp for ADA compliance, building insulation, windows.
Yes, so under that, I think is question 3, like, what is your project? That should include all of the work that you're going to be doing. You want to tell us where the Bruhn funds are going to focus. Like, are you hoping that they will pay for a certain piece of this project? But yes, we want to know about all of the proposed work that you're thinking about. Really what we're hoping to avoid is we've had situations where we've funded a project, we go out for the site visit to take the photos and really get them ready to start through the review process. And then they mention, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this other thing in the building at the same time, and we go, oof, okay, let's figure out how to way for you all to move forward with your work, but to do it in a way that's going to be consistent with the grant. And so the more information we have up front, the easier it is for us to kind of plan for those things. And preservation is like we love planning, so give us all that info.
Next question is about BABA, which you answered. The project we are considering has no funding in place at this time, and the grant would be the first part of the funding stack. And I assume that would make the application less competitive.
It depends on how big your project is. It depends on what your timeline is for securing the other funds. If you are if it's like going back to that slate roof example, if you're asking for a big chunk from Bruhn and you are planning and have a plan in place to kind of raise the rest of the money, in 2025, that puts you in a pretty good position. If Bruhn is the first money in and you're a $2 million project, it's definitely going to make you less competitive. In this application cycle, there have been years where PTV has put money early into projects. We understand the value of it is for that and what it says to other funders about like our confidence in a project moving forward. And it's this year, it's really coming back to that idea of like there is so much uncertainty with the funding landscape right now, and we want to be sure we're picking projects that can complete work and are going to move quickly so we can really demonstrate, a lot of progress in a short amount of time.
There's a group that is not sure they'll be able to get the preliminary weatherization and architectural estimates done before later in May. So, what is the guess about the possibility Bruhn grant would be offered next year?
Round 7. So the way this works is the National Park Service puts out a notice of funding opportunity, a NOFO or a NOFA, depending on how they talk about it. There has not been a NOFO for round 7 yet, and so we have not been able to apply for those funds. And so in previous years, we've said we've applied, but we're waiting to hear back. At this point, we haven't had an opportunity to apply. There have been rumblings in the conversations I've had with MPS staff that NOFO is in progress and it will go public at some point, but we haven't seen it. And so right now, this is the only money that we are sure is available for projects.
And can Bruhn funds several aspects of a restoration at once, such as siding, roofing, window restoration?
Sure, there could be a probably like an exterior envelope project would be how you'd package that. Could include a couple different items of exterior work. I would encourage you all to kind of batch things together. You don't want to go to the kitchen sink route of having 7 small projects that you're just kind of cobbling together to reach that $60,000 mark or that $50,000 mark. But an exterior envelope is a very well-defined part of the building that needs to be secure. And so that those make sense to put those things together.
And can Bruhn be used as matching funds, which you touched on a little bit?
Bruhn can be used as matching funds. You don't want to bank on using it as matching funds for other federal sources because every federal funding program is going to have different rules around that. Bruhn is a good match for the Division for Historic Preservation grant, cultural facilities. You can use it as match for the downtown and village center tax credits. You can use it as match for 1772 Foundation, which is a small preservation trust of Vermont grant. It's good match for state level funding. It's easier to do it, when you're looking at state and local sources.
That's the end of the chat box.
I like that. May I ask a question?
Yeah.
What about the MERP grant? Would this be compatible with that or dovetail into that?
Yes. So we have had grants in like round 4 and 5 that have also received MERP funding. There is certainly a way to kind of pair those weatherization improvements with other preservation improvements. We'd want to know about what's in the scope of your MERP grant. What type of work are you doing? The other thing that we're keenly aware of is I know the MERP grants have a pretty accelerated timeline as well, where work needs to be completed by the end of, I think, next calendar year, and just making sure that we're timing everything well, that our review process is not holding up progress on your MERP funded work. But there's certainly a way to kind of balance those two things.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there is, if it's helpful, down at the bottom, there on the react button, you can raise a hand, which will put that little, emoji hand up and kind of shove you up on my screen. If you want to turn your screen on, raise a hand, you can do that. If we have exhausted all of your questions and you're just ready for a nap, that's totally fine too.
We have one more in the chat, Jenna.
Yeah.
We're at the beginning of a whole hall renovation, but are interested in the Bruhn grant for our roof as the first step in a multi-step effort. Do we need architectural drawings of the whole project or just the roof?
If you plan on doing the roof as kind of a standalone item, and you let us know in the application, like we know we have a whole building rehabilitation. We're very early in the process. Like we're going to do the roof this year and next year, and we're going to start the rest of the rehab planning. That is okay. And then PTV will just be involved in that planning. we need to be careful of like, it'll be the timing of when do you undertake those other rehab projects. And for a clean review, the ideal would be to do your roof work, be planning your other items, and then close your Bruhn grant. The easement will go in place, and then PTV will be involved on the rest of the work through the easement process, but it'll kind of close your federal grant, and then you'll be free to move on with your work. We've definitely seen that happen, and it's something that we can work with you all on if you have a very kind of well-defined initial scope of work. Jen.
There we go. Hi, sorry. So because we have a VTI grant for Bean Hall, we're gonna end up with an easement from that anyway. And we had the roof question. This is just kind of like the first part of that. Will that easement count for the easement that you would use for Bruhn, or would they be two separate easements? It doesn't matter to us. I'm just curious.
I believe they would be two separate kind of liens. The preservation easement is very specific to kind of like the preservation focus. I believe the VTI is more of a notice of interest. You know, VTI, NBRC, those types of liens are more interested in the use of the building and the ownership of the building, whereas we're very focused on how the building is maintained. The beauty of that question is both of those programs live within PTV, and we'll help you figure that out.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We're at 2:27, so that timed very well. I'm happy to stay on a couple more minutes if folks have questions. If not, I'll figure out how to end the recording and save everything. Oh, go ahead, Janet.
Yeah, I just have one more question, just kind of jumping ahead, just so again I can inform my client. The grant administration process, is it pretty intense? I mean, is it, because I know some of the stuff I see from like VCDP is pretty intense.
Yeah.
So is it something that you think that like this board of directors would probably be able to handle on their own? Would they need guidance from, somebody helping them with that?
Bruhn is definitely not as intense as VCDP, which is HUD money. The nice thing about Bruhn is PTV bears the brunt of the reporting, and then really we're going to our subgrantees and we're asking for like, give us an update on project progress. Like, let's make sure we're, consistent with how much money we've spent to this point. And then PTV takes all of that information and compresses it into the reporting that then goes off. So I would say this is actually a really good introduction to federal reporting where they're not going to have to bear the entire brunt of it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Lots of good information.
Anyone else? Great. Well, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Denise and I. I'm happy to chat more with folks. We are going to